Imagine being in the middle of a police operation and suddenly being doused with a bucket of water, completely unaware that it was all planned. That's exactly what happened to Steven Seagal, the man who transformed the surprise into a lesson in pure intelligence. While the police thought they had it under control, he moved each piece like a chess master, anticipating every reaction, every mistake, every move. What seemed like chaos became a perfect strategy. Discover how a simple act of apparent vulnerability became a demonstration of mental power that no one will forget. No one in Dust Bay ever understood why a man like Steven Seagal chose this town to disappear into. He arrived one dusty afternoon, rented an old cabin on the edge of the desert, and said he just wanted a quiet place to forget the world. A week later, people saw him handcuffed, blood on his face, being dragged out of a bar by 3 drunken cops just after he had intervened to protect 2 girls who were being harassed. "Do you have any idea who you just hit?" Sergeant Rick Dalton growled. Steven looked at him calmly and firmly. "Yeah," he said. 3 cowards in uniform." Rick laughed, spat on the floor, and said, "In Dust Bay, I am the law, and I don't like heroes." That night, the man who once stood for American strength and justice was behind bars in a cell that smelled of rust and old blood in the middle of a town that looked peaceful on the outside but was rotten on the inside. No one knew it yet, but that night marked the beginning of Steven Seagal's final fight. Not to save the world, but to remind it that justice never truly dies. "Hey baby, you forgot to smile at me." That was the first thing Rick Dalton said as he burst into the bar. The place was half full, the air thick with heat and whiskey. The old ceiling fan whirred, but only moved hot air around. Luis was behind the counter cleaning glasses. His daughters, Maria and Sofia, were trying to keep up with the crowd. Rick leaned against the bar, his badge still attached to his belt, even though it was Friday night and he was already drunk. "Mark and Kane," they continued, laughing as if they owned the damn place. Maria let out a nervous laugh. "Good evening, officers. What can I get you?" Rick grinned. "How about that smile first, then maybe a beer, or maybe you'd prefer I check your liquor license, just to make sure Dad here is playing fair." Luis looked up from the sink. "Rick, they're just working. Take your drink and don't cause any trouble tonight." Rick turned to him, his grin fading. "Trouble? I'm just having a friendly chat." "Luis, what? Got something to hide?" Mark slammed his glass down on the counter. "Yeah, maybe he's got some illegals cooking up in the back again. We could check, right? Sergeant?" Luis froze. He'd heard that tone before. The kind of tone that came before fines, threats, or before something was accidentally broken. He tried to stay calm. "Want a drink or not?" Rick laughed. "We'll have 3 cold ones and a smile from your girls. That's the rule here in Dust Valley. Respect your officers." Sophia arrived with the bottles, her head down. When she tried to leave, Sia reached out and grabbed her wrist. "Where are you going, sweetheart? We're not finished yet." Maria took a step forward. "Let her go." Rick raised his glass as if making a toast. "Look at this, the little one's got character. I guess it runs in the family." Luis dropped his towel on the counter. "Stop it. You're drunk. Want a drink? Pay and sit down. If you touch my girls again, you're out." The laughter stopped. Rick turned his head slowly. The bar went quiet. Even the yuck box seemed to go dark. "Now you tell me what to do, Luis." Luis swallowed but didn't back down. "I'm telling you to show some respect." Rick's face hardened. He stepped away from the bar, circled around Luis, and shoved him back so hard the man hit the counter and stumbled. "You think you can talk to me like that? I could shut this place down tomorrow. Health. Code. Liquor license. Pick a reason." From the far corner, a chair was dragged. Steven Seagal stood up. He'd been there since dusk, silent, keeping to himself. Long white beard, old denim jacket, boots still dusty from the road. No one recognized him. That's how he wanted it. After 50 years of cameras, interviews, and people wanting a piece of him, he wanted peace and quiet. A place where his name meant nothing, where he could simply be an old man finishing his drink before heading back to a rented cabin outside of town. He looked at Rick, his voice calm. "That's enough." Rick turned away, narrowing his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" "Just a customer," Steven said. "But I've seen enough of your kind to know how this ends. Back off. Look, we've got a preacher here. Why don't you sit down before you break your hip, old man?" Steven didn't move. His voice didn't rise, but there was something about it that made everyone listen. You wear that badge. You don't just carry a gun, you carry the law. Act like it. Rick picked up a half-full dirty glass of water from the counter. You want justice? He said, pouring the water in Steven's face. For a second, no one moved. Water dripped from his beard to the floor. Then the old man exhaled slowly and evenly. He brought his hand to his face, wiped it with the back of his hand, and looked at Rick. His eyes weren't angry, just tired. Rick smiled. What? No response. Maybe the old cowboy had lost his edge. C.A. laughed and took a step toward Maria again. That was the mistake. Steven moved. One step, a twist of his arm, and Cale fell to the floor, panting. Mark struck randomly, but Steven ducked, caught his wrist, and twisted it until a crack echoed in the room. Rick reached for his gun, but Steven's boot slammed into his stomach before he could draw it. 3 men in under 5 seconds. Steven lay still, breathing through his nose. Calm down, he said quietly. Get up, step outside, and remember who you're supposed to be. Rick squirmed, clutching his side. The smile vanished, replaced by something darker. He leaned toward his pistol, the metal squealing loudly in the silent room. You just assaulted 3 officers, hiss. Steven didn't move. No, I stopped 3 drunks from hurting a man's family. Mark and Cale staggered to their feet, drawing their weapons. Luis held up his hands. Please don't shoot, you're all crazy. Don't tell me what to do, Luis. Rick twisted his face. Man, he said, holding up his hands for them to see. Steven didn't fight back, just nodded once. Good, he said, putting his hands behind his head. The whole bar watched as they handcuffed him. Too tight, shoved toward the door. Rick leaned close. Sour breath. Think you're some kind of hero? Around here, heroes die in the dark. Steven said nothing. As they dragged him into the thick night air, he turned his head toward Luis and spoke loud enough for the bar to hear. Watch that camera, Luis. The truth's in your hands now. Rick pushed him toward the patrol car. Mark got behind the wheel. The engine started. Gravel crunched under the wheels. Inside the bar, no one spoke for a long time. The ceiling fan kept spinning, slow and useless. Maria leaned against the counter, her voice trembling. Dad, what's going to happen to him? Luis stared at the door, still holding his phone, where the camera light flickered faintly red. I don't know, he said quietly. But if that man was telling the truth, those bastards just made a mistake they won't get out of. If you don't want to miss our content, hit the like button and subscribe below. Also, turn on notifications and tell us where you're listening from. We appreciate your support. The tension in the street was palpable. Curious and alarmed neighbors watched from behind their windows. Some held phones recording every movement, while others murmured among themselves, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding before their eyes. Steven Seagal was there, fully aware of every gesture the officers made, yet remaining calm. His intense, focused gaze showed not a trace of fear. Every drop of water that fell on him, sprayed from a police truck hose, seemed to vanish into thin air, unable to disturb the serenity emanating from his presence. The police officers, for their part, acted as if they were on a high-risk mission. Their faces were a mixture of determination and bewilderment. Some tried to maintain a professional demeanor while others looked uncomfortable, as if something about the scene didn't quite add up. No one knew, except Steven, everything was meticulously planned. Every step, every gesture, every decision made at that moment was part of an elaborate game of preparation he himself had designed. A senior officer, his voice trembling, shouted orders to his colleagues. Come on, this can't go on, we need control. But his words rang hollow. The strength of the situation lay not in the threat of the water, or the apparent disorder, but in the atmosphere Steven had created around him. A mixture of lethal calm and absolute confidence. Every move the police officers made was predictable, like pieces on a chessboard he had analyzed for weeks. Steven wasn't alone in his strategy. Behind him, hidden from the officers' view, several undercover agents observed the reaction of each member of the police force. Every expression, every micro-gesture was recorded and analyzed. The intense, cold rain lashed his face, soaking his hair and clothes. But his posture didn't change. There was no hurry, no panic. Only calculated patience, a calmness that seemed to defy the logic of those around him. More water pressure, shouted another officer, convinced that physical intimidation would suffice. But Steven remained motionless. Even when the jet of water hit him directly in the shoulder, he didn't flinch. His breathing was controlled, deep and measured, like a master who knows his opponent's dance, before they even make a single move. Meanwhile, The crowd that had gathered around him began to murmur. Some started to question the police's authority, others simply watched, amazed and confused. Among them one could see the mixture of fear, admiration, and bewilderment that Steven's presence evoked. No one could deny the silent power that emanated from him, a power that didn't depend on weapons or shouts, but on his sheer presence and absolute control of the situation. Suddenly, an officer tried to get closer, attempting to break through the invisible barrier that Steven had created. But every step he took seemed calculated to be anticipated and neutralized. With minimal, almost imperceptible movements, Steven shifted his body's direction, deflecting any possible contact, and the officer ended up staggering, confused and frustrated. The crowd held their breath, aware that something extraordinary was happening. At that moment, Steven seized the opportunity to speak, his voice firm and resonant. "I know what you're thinking. I know what you're feeling. But all of this is part of a larger plan." His tone wasn't threatening. It was one of absolute certainty. Every word he uttered carried weight, as if each syllable held a secret message that only those attentive enough could understand. A young officer, visibly nervous, whispered to his partner, "He's crazy. How can he be so calm under this much pressure?" His partner didn't reply, he simply observed. Unable to tear his eyes away from the scene, Steven, as the water jets continued to fall, moved a barely perceptible hand, and one of the undercover agents silently stepped forward. In an instant, without the officers noticing, he discreetly placed electronic devices near the police communications equipment. Every movement was choreographed, as if it were part of a carefully rehearsed dance. In a matter of seconds, the information the police considered secure was no longer so. But Steven's true mastery wasn't in the technology or the hidden devices. His true power lay in his ability to read people. Every glance, every breath, every reaction contained information. As the crowd slowly dispersed, some began to understand that they were witnessing something much bigger than a simple police confrontation. It was a game of strategy, wit, and emotional control that few could understand in real time. Finally, the officer in charge, soaked and exhausted, gestured his surrender. The hose went out, and water began to trickle down the street, forming small rivulets that reflected the lamplight. The tension slowly dissipated, but a sense of awe lingered in the air. Steven, soaked to the bone, stood firm, a barely perceptible smile on his face. "All according to plan," he muttered to himself as he retreated from the scene with confident strides. The crowd, still in shock, began to applaud tentatively, acknowledging the audacity of what they had just witnessed. A few officers looked around, confused and humiliated, but unable to deny Steven's flawless execution. That night, as the city slowly returned to normal, Steven knew he had sent a clear message. Brute force and intimidation only hold power when they are misunderstood and unanticipated. His name, his reputation, and his intelligence had been cemented in the minds of all who witnessed the event. And while most would never understand the details of his plan, all would remember the image of a man standing under a stream of water, serene and composed, demonstrating that true strength lies in strategy, patience, and the mind. When he left, Steven left behind more than soaked streets and bewildered officers. He left a lesson about the power of ingenuity and preparation, and how even in the most adverse circumstances, calmness and strategy can completely change the course of events. The story of that night would become legend, whispered and etched in the memories of those who witnessed it, a reminder that true strength never needs to demonstrate violence to prevail. The city was silent after the incident, but the tension had not disappeared. It had only transformed into a more subtle, almost invisible sensation that permeated every alley and window. Steven Seagal walked through the dispersing crowd, soaked but unperturbed, his gaze fixed on a point beyond anyone's view. Every step he took seemed calculated, precisely measured, as if his mere presence dictated the rhythm of everything around him. The police, still stunned, began to withdraw, exchanging bewildered and angry glances. No one spoke clearly. Words seemed to betray their disbelief. "How could he stay so calm under so much pressure?" one officer muttered, wiping his face with his jacket sleeve. Another simply stood watching the alley Steven had just walked through, unable to grasp the magnitude of what had just transpired. But Steven wasn't finished. Every action that night had been only the first piece of a larger plan. As the crowd dispersed and the officers returned to their vehicles, he stopped in front of a small, abandoned building that seemed insignificant to everyone else. His movements were silent, precise, almost ritualistic. He unlocked the door with the key he had prepared days before, and the scent of dust and damp wood enveloped him. Inside, a set of monitors, maps, and communication equipment awaited him. Steven's true operations room. He leaned over the central table and began reviewing the recordings of the confrontation. Every camera, every angle, had been strategically positioned to capture the reactions of the police officers, the movements of the crowd, and even the murmurs of bystanders. As he analyzed the videos, a team of undercover agents began sending real-time reports from different parts of the city. Every detail, every gesture, every word was being recorded, cataloged, and studied. Nothing escaped Steven's trained eye. On the screen, one of the officers, visibly confused, could be clearly seen trying to organize his colleagues as they struggled to maintain their composure. Under the pressure of a single man, Steven's calmness wasn't just impressive, it was strategic. Every move the police officers thought they had under control, he had already anticipated. Every attempt at intimidation had been transformed into intelligence, every jet of water an opportunity to gauge the mental fortitude of those around him. As he analyzed the scene, a message appeared on one of the monitors: target secured, reactions and data complete. Proceeding to the next phase, Steven nodded almost imperceptibly. Every step had been planned, every detail meticulously prepared over weeks. The operation wasn't simply about demonstrating his skill or challenging the police. The aim was to demonstrate how foresight, composure, and intelligence could overcome even the most intimidating brute force. In the streets, rumors began to spread. Some neighbors told others what they had seen: a soaked man standing firm under jets of water, showing neither fear nor anger. Others recounted how the officers seemed disoriented, as if every action had been anticipated. Little by little, the story took on a life of its own, fueling the fascination and awe of those who heard it. Steven, meanwhile, knew that the true lesson had yet to be revealed. Calmness and control were more powerful weapons than any physical force. Back in his operations room, he began to prepare the next phase of his plan. This did not involve physical confrontation. This was a test of ingenuity, strategy, and how perception can be manipulated without anyone noticing. He unfolded a map of the city on the table, precisely marking every point of interest, every potential threat, and every escape route. His mind worked like a Swiss watch, meticulous, precise, and without margin for error. Meanwhile, an undercover agent stationed in a nearby building observed from an elevated vantage point. With binoculars, he reported every police movement, every conversation between officers, and every reaction from bystanders. Everything was documented: the confusion, the surprise, and the silent admiration of those who had witnessed the incident. Nothing was left to chance. Even public perception was part of Steven's plan. Outside, the atmosphere began to shift. The city, which minutes before had been gripped by the tension of the moment, was now in a state of anticipation. Rumors grew, and public curiosity increased with each account. Some even approached the scene, questioning witnesses and recording the story to share on social media. Steven understood that the narrative was as powerful as the action itself. The way the story was told would influence everyone's perception. As he reviewed the data, a sound alerted him. A vehicle was stealthily approaching the building. Without showing alarm, he moved to the window and watched as a group of officers searched a nearby alley for any sign of suspicious activity. Their every step was monitored and anticipated. Steven didn't need to hide. He moved with the certainty of someone who knew the terrain better than anyone. His presence was invisible, but his control absolute. Then, with an almost imperceptible gesture, he sent instructions to his undercover agents. Proceed with the disinformation phase. Maintain visual control, record reactions. In a matter of seconds, the strategically placed devices began emitting signals that confused the officers, making them believe there was activity where there was none. Every move by the police was now a reaction to manipulated information, and every reaction was meticulously recorded. Steven, soaked and composed, allowed himself a small smile. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. There was no improvisation, no luck, only strategy, patience, and a profound understanding of human psychology. Even the most seasoned officers found themselves caught in an invisible web of anticipation and manipulation, unable to react effectively to a man who had already foreseen every possible scenario. Night fell, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Every action by Steven was measured, every decision calculated. His control of the moment and his command of the situation had transformed a simple confrontation into a lesson in strategy and perception. While the police struggled to maintain their composure, Steven demonstrated, with actions rather than words, that true strength lies not in physical aggression, but in intelligence, foresight, and absolute calm in the face of chaos. Finally, when everything seemed to be at its peak, Steven discreetly withdrew his undercover agents and deactivated the disinformation devices. The city, now shrouded in an almost reverential silence, began to grasp the magnitude of what had just transpired. It wasn't just a man drenched under a torrent of water. It was a demonstration that ingenuity, preparation, and control can completely alter the outcome of any situation. Steven allowed himself one last glance at the empty street before vanishing into the night. Every step, every decision, every gesture had been part of a plan that transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. The officers, still bewildered and disoriented, could barely comprehend the lesson they had just witnessed. That true strength is not measured by physical power, but by the mind that can anticipate, manipulate, and control every element around it. And as the city slowly returned to its routine, the story of that confrontation began to weave itself into the collective memory. A story that would be told time and again as a reminder that even under the most intense pressure, calmness and strategy will always prevail. As night thickened over the city, Steven Seagal no longer walked among the crowds, but instead observed from a strategic vantage point in a tall building overlooking several key streets. From there, he could visually monitor police movements and anticipate any action they might take. Every officer patrolling the area moved about unaware that they had already fallen into the labyrinth he had prepared weeks before. The monitors in front of him displayed multiple angles of the city, corners, alleyways, entrances to abandoned buildings, even rooftops overlooking the main thoroughfare. There was no place that wasn't under surveillance. Each camera was positioned to capture crucial details, gestures, glances, changes in posture. Every human reaction was valuable data for Steven, another element in the plan that was about to culminate. Inside the police station, confusion grew. Officers exchanged information, but their reports were fragmented, contradictory. "We saw a man, he seemed alone, but then he appeared on another street," one said. "I don't understand how he moves so fast, as if he knows exactly where we'll be." Their superiors tried to remain calm, but the uncertainty was palpable in every word, in every glance. The feeling of losing control intensified with each passing minute. Meanwhile, Steven reviewed the data collected by his undercover agents. Every step the officers took was recorded, every decision recorded and analyzed. But it wasn't just about anticipating their moves. It was about teaching them, about demonstrating that true strength lies not in physical intimidation, but in preparation, composure, and ingenuity. Every action he took was designed to clearly show how the mind triumphs over brute force. At that moment, a nervous young officer approached the shift supervisor. "We have to regroup and look for him. We can't let someone play games with us like this." The supervisor nodded, but his eyes betrayed doubt. He knew that every move could be anticipated, that any attempt at direct confrontation would likely end in frustration. Steven, from his position, discreetly activated a device that emitted false activity signals at 3 different points in the city. It was the disinformation phase he had carefully planned. The police reacted immediately, rushing into empty streets, searching abandoned buildings, questioning confused passers-by. Every action they took was being monitored, every mistake noted. The city had become a chessboard, and Steven knew every possible move. Meanwhile, a group of onlookers had gathered near the site of the first confrontation. They murmured among themselves, recorded videos with their phones, and shared every detail on social media. The story of the soaking wet man who had defied the entire police force was beginning to go viral, increasing the pressure on the officers and giving Steven an added advantage. public fear and admiration. Every glance, every comment, every camera was another piece of the puzzle. Back in his makeshift operations room, Steven began planning the next stage, a proxy confrontation that would test not only physical strength, but also the police officer's reaction time, judgment, and patience. Every decision the police made would be recorded and used to teach a silent lesson about control, anticipation, and strategy. At the same time, the police began to realize that the disinformation was working. "There are no real leads," an officer said. "It's like they're leading us nowhere." The confusion grew, and with it the tension. Every step they took was being watched, every move interpreted and anticipated. Steven wasn't just controlling the situation, he was controlling how they perceived it. In an unexpected turn, an officer tried to take the initiative. He ran toward what he thought was a safe alley, intending to catch Steven. But upon arriving, he found only shadows and emptiness. The feeling of emptiness and disorientation intensified, and he soon understood that every action the police were taking was being manipulated. Frustration began to turn into despair. The powerlessness was palpable. Steven observed everything with absolute calm. His mind worked on multiple levels, assessing the effectiveness of the disinformation, monitoring the officer's reactions, and calculating the next moves. His control of the situation was total. Every step the police took confirmed his theory. Physical strength wasn't enough to control the unpredictable, but foresight and strategy were. Meanwhile, the city remained in a state of anticipation. Passers-by and residents, witnesses to the incidents, shared the story on their social networks, increasing both the tension and the fascination. Each account further exaggerated Steven's composure, turning him into an almost legendary figure. The public attention added another layer of pressure on the police, who felt increasingly powerless and confused. In the operations room, Steven began preparing the final phase of the night, a maneuver that would not only confound the officers but also unequivocally demonstrate how preparation, intelligence, and strategy can overcome brute force. Every step was calculated. The locations of the operation, the monitoring devices, the escape routes, and even the elements of distraction had been meticulously planned. When the time came, Steven sent a discreet signal to his undercover agents. A series of coordinated events began to unfold across the city. Flashing lights, unexpected sounds, strategic movements that seemed random but were designed to provoke the maximum reaction. The officers, caught in the web of misinformation and manipulation, moved frantically, unaware that everything had been planned from the start. Finally, Steven allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Every step, every reaction, every mistake by the police confirmed what he knew. True strength lies not in intimidation or impulsive action. Intelligence, strategy, and absolute calm are the most powerful weapons a human being can possess. The night, though dark and fraught with tension, he was demonstrating his lesson clearly and forcefully. As the police finally began to retreat, silently defeated, the city began to grasp what had just transpired. It wasn't just a man defying the officers. It was a reminder that control, foresight, and patience always prevail over brute force. The story of Steven Seagal, soaked but unflappable, was becoming a tale that would be told for years to come, an example of how the mind can overcome any physical obstacle. And in his observation tower, Steven switched off the monitors one by one with a barely perceptible smile. The night had been a triumph of ingenuity over strength, of strategy over impulsiveness, of calm over chaos. Every piece of his plan had worked flawlessly, leaving a clear lesson. Even under the most adverse circumstances, intelligence and foresight can always master any situation. Dawn was beginning to peek timidly between the city's tall buildings, but the tension still lingered in the streets. The officers, exhausted and confused, began to regroup, reviewing every step of the previous night with disbelief. The feeling of having been manipulated grew stronger with each passing minute. The police had acted swiftly, but every action had been anticipated, every movement controlled, every reaction predictable. Steven Seagal still hadn't moved from his vantage point. From there, he watched as the police tried to regroup, as they discussed strategies and reviewed camera footage, attempting to decipher what seemed impossible to understand. Every discussion, every incorrect hypothesis about his whereabouts, confirmed the effectiveness of his plan. It wasn't just about avoiding capture, it was about demonstrating that true control lies in the mind and preparation, not in force or intimidation. Meanwhile, in a nearby park, a group of civilians who had witnessed the events gathered, discussing what had happened with a mixture of astonishment and nervousness. "Did you see how he moved? Like he knew exactly what they were going to do," one of them said. "I've never seen anything like it. It's like he's playing chess with the whole city," another replied. Social media was starting to fill with stories and videos, some further exaggerating Steven's imperturbable calm, turning him into an almost mythical figure. Inside the station, the tension was mounting. The officers looked at each other with a mixture of frustration and respect. No one could explain how a single man had managed to control a situation that seemed impossible to handle. They traded theories. "Maybe there are more people involved," suggested a rookie. "No, this isn't normal," retorted a veteran. The feeling of powerlessness mingled with a silent respect for someone they had previously underestimated. Steven began preparing the next phase of his plan. An indirect, measured and calculated confrontation designed to teach a lesson impossible to ignore. It wasn't about causing physical harm. It was about demonstrating that foresight and strategy could disarm even the most powerful. Every step had been calculated for days. Escape routes, potential obstacles, observation points, security cameras, and the officers' likely reactions. Everything was under control. In a nearby alley, an officer decided to take the initiative. He believed he had found a pattern in Steven's movements and decided to move forward. But as he advanced, he encountered signs deliberately placed to confuse him: shadows, misplaced objects, strategic noises. Every element was designed to slow his advance and increase the confusion. The frustrated officer began to feel the situation slipping from his grasp, that every action he took was being anticipated. Steven observed every movement from his tower. His mind calculated several possible responses, but he always remained calm. There was no rushing, no unnecessary tension. Every mistake by the police was another piece of information, every hesitation an indication that his strategy was working. It wasn't just about evading them. It was about demonstrating that intelligence and preparation could overcome any physical obstacle. Elsewhere in the city, a group of agents tried to contact their superiors for guidance. Their voices were tense, filled with uncertainty. "We're completely uncoordinated. Every time we think we have a lead, it disappears," one said. The shift supervisor listened with frustration and concern. They couldn't ignore that something extraordinary was happening, and that any impulsive decision could worsen the situation. Meanwhile, Steven began to mobilize his covert resources to create a visual effect that would reinforce the impression of omnipresence. Flashing lights, strategic shadows, and calculated movements of unknown individuals generated the feeling that he was everywhere at once. The already alert city was now in a state of collective astonishment. The police couldn't distinguish reality from illusion, and every attempt to locate him proved fruitless. As the day wore on, Steven decided to escalate the final maneuver, a controlled confrontation that would force the officers to acknowledge his strategic superiority. However, this was not a physical confrontation. It would be a display of ingenuity, precision, and control. Every movement was coordinated, every detail meticulously planned, every reaction anticipated. The officers, caught between confusion and exhaustion, had no way of anticipating the crucial moment. A team of officers decided to act as a group, believing that sheer numbers could overcome individual strategy, but even that attempt was anticipated. Steven had laid out multiple escape routes and visual cues that led them astray without them realizing they were being guided to safe areas without direct contact. Every move reinforced his lesson. Preparation and intelligence always triumph over brute force. Observing from his tower, Steven felt a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. The police, despite their training and experience, had been outmaneuvered without direct confrontation. Every mistake, every hesitation, every impulsive reaction confirmed the effectiveness of his strategy. The city had witnessed a man who, armed only with ingenuity and composure, had managed to control a situation that seemed beyond his grasp. Finally, as the officers began to retreat, defeated but still not fully understanding what had transpired, Steven activated the final phase of his plan, a subtle message that would leave a clear lesson for everyone. It wasn't a written or spoken message. It was a silent demonstration of absolute control, proving that intelligence, strategy, and composure can overcome any physical or institutional obstacle. The night and early morning had ended, but the lesson remained indelibly etched. As the city began to recover from the confusion, civilians discussed what had happened with respect and admiration. The story of a soaked but unflappable man who had confronted the police and emerged victorious without violence spread rapidly. Steven Seagal's reputation was being cemented not by physical strength, but by his ability to anticipate, plan, and execute every detail with precision. By late morning, Steven had turned off the monitoring devices and climbed down from his tower. Every step of the night had been measured, every reaction anticipated. The lesson was complete. Intelligence, strategy, and composure not only control complex situations, they teach those who rely solely on force that there are higher forms of power. The city would remember that day for a long time, and his story would be told as an example of how the mind can master even the most overwhelming forces. The sun was high, illuminating the city as it slowly began to return to its routine, but the tension lingered on every corner. The officers, still reeling from the night's chaos, were gathered at the station. Frustration was palpable, but so was a growing respect for the man who had outmaneuvered them without a single act of violence. Each reflected on what had happened, trying to analyze how someone had manipulated the entire situation with almost superhuman precision. Steven Seagal, meanwhile, moved calmly through the city's shadows, observing unseen. Every detail of the previous night had been meticulously recorded in his mind. He had left no loose ends. Every action, every reaction, every movement had been anticipated. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a lesson for all those who underestimated the power of intelligence over brute force. As the police reviewed recordings and testimonies, they began to notice patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. Subtle signals, deliberate movements of objects. Even the way civilians reacted had all been carefully planned to confuse and disorient. They understood for the first time that this wasn't simple chaos or improvisation. Everything was meticulously orchestrated. On social media, the phenomenon grew. Videos and stories about Steven's calmness, his absolute control, and his ability to anticipate every move the police made went viral. People spoke of him as an unparalleled strategist, a man who had proven that the mind could overcome even the most powerful institutions. Every comment, every reaction reinforced the legend that was beginning to form around him. Steven decided it was time to close the lesson. He knew that remaining hidden wasn't enough. He needed to send a clear message, something the officers in the city would remember without question. He chose a central location where city activity was constant and visible to all. There, he prepared a subtle, almost imperceptible scene that conveyed absolute control. Strategically placed objects, lights highlighting key details, and carefully choreographed movements designed to attract the attention of those observing him without directly seeing him. The first officers to arrive were greeted by Steven's absolute calm. There was no confrontation, no threats, only presence, control, and the feeling that any attempt to act impulsively would be futile. Slowly, other officers began to arrive until a small group gathered in front of what appeared to be an ordinary space, but which had been transformed into a demonstration of strategy and patience. Steven finally introduced himself, not with violence, but with the calm of someone who knows every detail and every consequence of his actions. His movements were measured, his voice firm, yet serene. He explained step by step how he had anticipated every move, how every police reaction had been foreseen, and how the city had witnessed a lesson that transcended physical strength. The incredulous officers listened intently, finally grasping the magnitude of what they had experienced. "This isn't about physical power," Steven said, his gaze piercing each of them. "It's about preparation, intelligence, controlling the situation before it controls you. Force may prevail momentarily, but strategy and the mind control the final outcome." His words resonated with a quiet, yet unwavering authority. The officers, still absorbing the lesson, they began to feel an inner shift. Frustration transformed into respect, confusion into admiration. They understood they had been part of something bigger. something that taught them that underestimating planning and foresight could lead to costly mistakes. Each left with the feeling that this night had marked a turning point in their careers and in their perception of power and strategy. Meanwhile, Steven walked away through streets that now seemed calmer, more aware of his presence. The city had witnessed the power of mind over force, and the story of his ingenuity spread quickly. He wasn't a traditional hero. He hadn't raised weapons or caused harm. His victory lay in demonstrating that anticipation, composure, and planning could overcome any obstacle. On his final walk toward the city's outskirts, Steven reflected on what had happened. Every movement had been a test of patience, every reaction an indicator of control. The feeling of having accomplished the impossible gave him a quiet satisfaction. The city had learned its lesson, and he had confirmed once again that intelligence and strategy always over force and impulsiveness. As he disappeared into the shadows of the buildings, the last remaining officers stared into the empty space, finally understanding that they had been part of a masterclass. Cameras recorded the moment, civilians discussed it, and the story began to transform into legend. Steven Seagal had not only survived, he had taught an entire city that true strength lies in the mind, not in physical force. Finally, with the city awakening to a new normal and the officers returning to their routines, Steven stood on a high point, gazing at the horizon. The water that had once drenched him no longer mattered. It had all been part of the lesson. Calmness in the face of provocation, preparation in the face of chaos, and intelligence over brute force. The city would never forget that day, and his name would be remembered not for an act of violence, but for the perfect demonstration of control, strategy, and mental power. With one last glance at the city, Steven disappeared into the streets, leaving behind an indelible lesson. In a world that often relies on brute force and impulsive reaction, true victory belongs to those who think, plan, and act with precision. The story of that night would be told for years, and every officer, every civilian, every witness would remember the lesson that had forever changed the perception of power. And so, as the city resumed its rhythm and the dry sounds of night echoed in every corner, Steven Seagal became a legend, not for what he physically did, but for the way he taught everyone that the mind can overcome any obstacle, and that even absolute chaos can be controlled with patience, strategy, and absolute calm.